Hey guys, it's Mike here, and the trailer for No Time to Die, otherwise known as Bond 25, finally came out recently. This is a movie many years in the making now, and will be the long-awaited end of Daniel Craig's run as the iconic spy. However, honestly, I'm not excited for this movie at all, something I'm sure you already guessed from the title. So gather round as I'm about to explain why, and prove that the greatest Bond villain of all isn't Goldfinger, 006, or Blofeld, but rather the executives running the franchise itself. So ever since I was a kid, I've always loved the Bond franchise. Beginning first with perhaps the most iconic James Bond and Sean Connery, and perhaps my favorite as well. It was a cool action franchise, following the exploits of a suave British spy, as he went on various missions, used cool gadgets much like Batman, drank alcohol like it was water, banged every hot model he ever came in contact with, and cracked enough one-liners to make Arnold Schwarzenegger blush. It was the right combination of action and cheese, usually not taking itself quite too seriously, and allowing the audience to have a lot of fun along the way. Of course, over the decades, the man playing Bond changed, going from Sean Connery to George Lazenby, back to Sean Connery, eventually to Roger Moore, Timothy Dalton, who I thought was a very underrated Bond, with one of my favorite movies being License to Kill, and then on to Pierce Brosnan, who was the Bond of my generation growing up, and had a great opening film in GoldenEye, which of course went on to be one of the greatest movie video games of all time. Although unfortunately, as his tenure as Bond went on, it led to the writing and the overall filmmaking quality significantly dropping, until eventually we got terrible movies like Die Another Day, with nonsense like invisible cars and surfing on tidal waves. This led to a long hiatus in the James Bond franchise, before they eventually brought in Daniel Craig as the new James Bond, and went in the direction of a more gritty reboot, kind of in the vein of Christopher Nolan and Batman Begins. And when it comes to Daniel Craig as James Bond, his tenure with the character has been very hit or miss. It took him a little bit to find his footing with the character, which worked well in the first movie because it was more of an origin, and he had yet to become the suave Bond that we knew. And despite settling more into the role, as time went on and as each subsequent James Bond movie came out, he started to look more and more miserable, which is because the fact that he clearly didn't want to be there, saying that he would rather slit his wrists than come back for another Bond film, yet he continued to come back for them. I guess because the color green is more appealing than red. The first film that he was in was one of the greatest entries in the James Bond franchise, being well written, acted, and far more restrained compared to its predecessors. However, the next movie to come out, Quantum of Solace, ended up being one of the worst of the franchise. An incoherent mess of a film that took pretty much all of the goodwill from Casino Royale and flushed it down the toilet. However, there was yet another spike in quality with the next film, Skyfall, which had an interesting villain in Silva played by Javier Bardem, and delved into James Bond's psychology and his origins, being a meta-commentary on the franchise as a whole and taking everything back to basics and going old school, where James Bond ends the film by fighting off a legion of bad guys in his house with homemade booby traps. However, just like with Quantum of Solace, Spectre was a massive letdown, being yet another terrible and poorly written movie that did a terrible job of setting up James Bond's most iconic villain, Blofeld, and completely wasting a great actor in Christoph Waltz by barely even having him be in the movie, only to eventually have it turn into a campy mess. I don't know what they were thinking after what happened with Quantum, but ultimately it ended up being a massive failure. And part of the reason why this movie has taken so long to come out, because this movie has actually taken longer than any non-reboot James Bond movie in the past. Most James Bond movies only took about 2 to 3 years to come out, whereas we've been waiting for this movie since 2015, which I honestly feel like is way too long. But the reason this movie has taken so long to come out is because of a number of behind-the-scenes problems. Either because they continually replace the director, with Danny Boyle once being tapped to direct and then being replaced by Cary Fukunaga, idea. Daniel Craig dragging his feet on everything and taking as long as possible for him to finally get into this role and make the movie and approve the script. And clearly the fact that he just didn't want to be there, which is probably a large reason why it took so long. Although you would think that he'd want to get it done as quickly as possible, rather than making every single person who wants to see another James Bond movie wait for years and years. But honestly, I feel like the wait has actually been one of the biggest detriments to Bond 25. Because honestly, many fans were already starting to think that Daniel Craig overstayed his welcome by the time Spectre came out. He had already had 4 movies at that point, with 2 of them, of course, being terrible. So many of us just got to the point where it's like, okay, he doesn't want to be in the role, let him out of his contract, and just reboot the thing. But naturally, they wouldn't do that. Instead, they're going in quite a different direction, particularly a woke direction. As one of the biggest detriments to my excitement about this movie would have to be the politics. Something I'm sure you guys know that I love to see in each of these big blockbuster movies that never had any kind of woke politics whatsoever, suddenly having it shoved right in our faces. Because damn, isn't that a great strategy to make money and not go broke at all? Now, we've seen other iconic franchises start to take on woke attributes and suffer as a result, be it Star Wars with The Last Jedi, the MCU with Captain Marvel, and now Daniel Craig with a woke Bond who's trying to fit into the world of the Me Too movement and in-your-face girl power and feminism. Bring in a writer like Phoebe Waller-Bridge, who of course played the iconic L3, the propaganda-screaming robot from Solo, a Star Wars flop, to write the script. And bring in Lashana Lynch, someone who just so happens to be a different gender than James Bond, who is supposed to be replacing him as the new 007. Until of course fans found out about it, and just how stupid and insulting to their intelligence it was, and they rightfully complained, leading to the filmmakers backtracking, and now just having her being basically a sidekick who does nothing but demean James Bond every single time she gets the chance. Something I'm sure that all the James Bond fans are just gonna line up to see. I'm sure that nothing could possibly go wrong with trying to incorporate the Me Too movement into a James Bond movie, an escapist franchise about a suave male spy that's in no way at odds with literally every single aspect of current feminism. Sounds like a great idea. But maybe all of this could be forgiven if the movie itself actually looked great. And that comes to the trailer itself, which has all of the typical James Bond hallmarks, and yet nothing feels good or special about it. As to be expected, Daniel Craig looks miserable, and like he doesn't want to be there. Blofeld is back, despite being terrible in Spectre, and the plot seems to be basically a follow-up to that movie, which isn't very promising at all, especially given how bad the last follow-up James Bond movie was. The rest of it is just Bond looking weak compared to a supposedly strong female agent, who naturally it seems like they want to replace him. But considering that she's the worst part of the trailer, and no doubt the movie itself, I doubt that's gonna go over well with fans, or anyone who has even a slight appreciation for the Bond franchise. Looking at it, the whole movie feels as pointless as Dark Phoenix, a totally irrelevant film that's just waiting to come out so they can finally get rid of Craig and just reboot the damn thing. Maybe it'll end with Bond dying, and them trying to set up Lashana Lynch as the next 007 and the leader of the franchise, who they no doubt want to spawn countless follow-up movies. But considering that no one will like that, they're probably just gonna reboot it anyway and cast someone that people will actually spend money to see. Probably another James Bond. And ironically, Black Widow, an MCU movie about a spoilers, dead character, looks more like a Bond movie than this one, and actually looks good. The movie stars a strong female protagonist I actually care about, and who didn't need to tear down the patriarchy or need to constantly insult or look better than her male counterparts. All she needed was to be a well-written character, something that apparently only Kevin Feige understands nowadays. Well, at least sometimes. So despite the fact that I'm not excited about this movie in the least, I'm still going to be doing something in the lead up to this film. Something that I originally planned to do this year, but of course they delayed the movie again. and that is rewatching and marathoning all of the James Bond movies. I'll likely be doing this by actor, beginning of course with Sean Connery, and making my way up to the Daniel Craig movies. Can't wait to rewatch those again, and I'm sure I'll be doing plenty of videos on this throughout 2020, leading up to this inevitable flop. So if you want to see those videos, make sure to like this video, share it around, and of course, subscribe to this channel, and enable all notifications, so you can see all of my videos and community posts right away when they come out. And make sure to stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.